based and how long you've been playing basketball.
My name is David Simpson. I was born in Canada, married a Chicago girl, have kids in Hong Kong, South Africa, and here in Melbourne. Became an Australian citizen in 2009 and have been playing basketball for 61 years. I think that covers your questions, doesn't it?
Exactly. How old are you today? And perhaps you can then take us back to your earliest memory of basketball.
Okay, I'm 73 years old, which is fairly frightening. Earliest memories, and interestingly, you and I talked. The reason why we got into basketball was a very influential teacher. I was in the 7th grade. My history teacher, an incredible fellow named Robert Squee Gordon, was not only a terrific history teacher, but he had played college basketball and semi-pro basketball, such as it was in Canada. So he was my first coach, has been an influence in my whole life. Went on to have quite an illustrious career. He was the president of Basketball Canada. He was instrumental in bringing the Raptors to Toronto. And he was also the president of the largest community college in Canada. So it was very fortuitous that I met such an inspirational guy, and that's where my basketball started.
And did Canadian boys and girls grow up thinking about basketball, or was it, as was the case in Australia, a minor sport?
Yeah, I think that the parallels are very, very similar. Here, obviously, footy was king. In Canada, it was hockey. So, I've said in the past, for me, it's extraordinary where international basketball has come from and where they are now. It's completely inconceivable that Canada, for instance, could be, the number 2, team in world competition based on the World Cup, and similarly with Australia and Patty Mills, bringing the Boomers along as well. So it's a credit to all the people from before that helped bring basketball to fruition, I think.
We recently interviewed your colleague and friend, Rolly Holcomb, who spoke about the importance of coach in the US culture. Can you perhaps give us some context around the importance of coach in Canada? In Australia, we have coaches, of course, but in your part of the world, they're almost second to God.
Yeah, well, I think that perhaps the biggest difference is that so much of the basketball development is in the club system. That's changing in Canada, but historically anyway, it was your high school coach and then your college coach. So typically they were educationalists in addition to being athletes. And I think, putting a lot of priority on the development of the individual, not just in the sport, was pretty important. And I think Rolly's a really interesting example of what happened here in Australia, in the sense that a lot of American came over to teach, but also to kind of instill some interest in basketball.
Squee played for a college team, which was the Bishops.
Bishops University, which is a small liberal arts college, at the time about 1,200 people, so very small. But a proud basketball tradition. In 1994, despite the small size of student body, they were the national champions. So, yeah, Squee had gone there, and so following my mentor, I played basketball for 4 years at Bishops as well. Not a lot of universities were were recruiting slow white guys, so I was happy to have spent my time there.
So, early skills, Dave, perhaps you can tell us about what made you different in your team, what aspects of your game you had most pride in.
Yeah, well, obviously I'm not standing up, but I was pretty sure that I wasn't going to have much of a career as a rebounder or a banger. But I was intrigued always with the assist, and starting as a young fella, I always knew that I could get a game with older guys if I could, handle the ball and distribute the ball. So I was always of the mind that the assist was the most interesting part of the basketball game, and that's what I've focused on most of my life.
Growing up, you said that players that inspired you included Jason Kidd, John Stockton, Jason Williams. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about those players.
Yeah, but before I do that, I mean, I think one of the differences today is that kids can go online. There's YouTube videos. There's, constant streaming of games. So you can pick out a player and study them to the nth degree. For me, probably my biggest influence was a guy named Butch Staples, who played at Bishop's before me. And he was a superb passer, assist man. And so that was the early influence. And then after that, I followed all the greats, as you say. In addition to those fellows, Larry Bird and Magic Johnson were great, but I think probably the greatest assist guy that's come along, certainly in my lifetime, was Jason Williams, affectionately known as White Chocolate. And if nobody's ever actually watched his highlight reel, it's absolutely fascinating. He's the master of the no-look pass.
At some stage, you were courtside with arguably the greatest of all time, Michael Jordan. Perhaps you can tell us about that.
Yeah, I have three basic stories about Michael Jordan, and it was the evolution of his career. A fellow that I played basketball with at Bishop's, John Field, who was a good player but a very, very good student, ended up as a professor at Duke University. So I went down to visit him, and he got tickets to the Duke, North Carolina game, which is at Cameron Stadium, which is the event of the year. And North Carolina was featuring this freshman that everybody was talking about, the Michael Jordan. But the North Carolina team was stacked with James Worthy and Sam Perkins, et cetera. So at that point, he didn't stand out. But the next year, a bunch of guys and I that go to the college finals every year were down in New Orleans at the Superdome watching North Carolina play Georgetown. And as I was saying earlier on, we had the worst seats in the world in those football stadiums. You could be miles away. So we surreptitiously snuck down on the court, and we were behind the backboard when Jordan hit the final basket. So that sort of cemented his career. Thereafter, I moved to Chicago for work, and the advertising agency that I had been working for had season tickets. Now, up until that point, the Bulls were terrible, so nobody actually wanted to go to see them. So I managed to scarper up all the tickets for the first 12 home games. So I got to see Michael Jordan, who was the third pick in the draft, come on board and progressively help improve the Bulls. It took a while, and then of course in 1991 the three-peat and the double repeat was started, and by that time you couldn't get those tickets for love nor money. So that was interesting. So I've seen Jordan through the ages, and I have to agree with most pundits that he is the greatest of all time.
Yeah. Dave, back to your history, you played from 7th grade through high school and into college. What was your crowning achievement at that sort of point of your game?
Gosh. Well, I got I got picked for the high school all-star team in Quebec. So that was pretty special, and they made me the captain of Bishop's in my final year. We didn't have tremendous success in college, but it was fun, and we were competitive. And then when I went into my working life and was spending time trying to manage work in addition to sports, etc. I was on a couple of senior teams, and we did win the summer championship. And I played with an amazing guy named Harry Brown, who had been at Oklahoma with the likes of Gar Hurd, and so he was pretty great. I was warming the bench, obviously, but that was probably one of the great ones. And then over time, as I moved around the world, I joined, various clubs and pickup games and what have you. And we were in the South African championships. We came in second, but as I tell people, I think the youngest guy on the team wasn't born by the time I was out of college, so there was a big age gap.
Your studies took you to Europe.
Yeah, I went to the London School of Economics, or as my kids say, the London School of Home Economics. Played basketball there, and again, we were in the university championships, and again, we came up short. We got the silver medal, but it was a fun time, and I met some terrific people that are still friends today.
and Europe wasn't really the stopping point for your career journey and international, I guess, roaming. Where did you go to after Europe?
Well, I came back to Canada after my graduate studies, and I was in Canada for about 5 or 6 years. Got transferred to Chicago, which is, as I say, where I met my wife, and then was recruited to go to Tokyo. Was in Tokyo for a few years, then Hong Kong. Went to South Africa. That was a fairly interesting time with the unbanning of the ANC and Mandela's release. That was a fascinating time. And then we moved here to Australia, and we were here for 5 years. And we often wonder why we ever left, but we did. Went back to Hong Kong for a couple of years, and then New York for 7 years, and finally came back here and haven't left since.
Tell us about the part of your life here in Australia, and in particular the basketball, I guess, aspect of the life that you built here with your family.
Well, another anecdote, you know, you always try to search out where basketball is being played, you know, and for me, it was a great way to extend my social network in addition to staying fit. So, of course, everybody told me that you had to go down to MSAC. That was the heart of basketball. So I rocked up to a new place, and you really don't know what's going on, but I spot a fellow that I've known ever since, Larry Holmes. And at the time, let's be honest, there weren't very many people of color who were around. So I went up to Larry because I assumed he was American, and asked him how it worked, and he sort of showed me around and introduced me, and I'll be forever grateful. And I was at MSAC probably every week for the time that we were in Australia. And as I said, we left for a while and I came back, and a couple of days after I came back, I went straight down to MSAC, which was, you know, the new Albert Park. And who's there but Larry Holmes? So, you know, Larry shows me around again, gets started, and I have this running gag with Larry, who's slightly older than me. And actually, Larry was the one that introduced me to Myths and Legends as well, but I have the standing joke that when I get to the pearly gates, there's going to be Larry showing me where the next pickup game is.
Perhaps we can talk about your introduction to Myths and Legends and the transition to Masters basketball.
Yeah, so as I say, Larry Holmes tipped me into the Tuesday night game, so I started going there. I can't honestly remember my first Saturday game, but that must have started soon after. I guess I wasn't sort of fully plugged in when the first Adelaide Masters games were on, so I missed that one. But the following year, I went to the Pan Pacs with the team, and I think we won that year, as we often did. And you know, it's just been a magical ride since. The first international, I guess the international was Sydney, and then we did Turin, and then we did Auckland. So, and then every year in between, either Adelaide or up in the Gold Coast. So it's been great. But to be perfectly honest, as much as I love those tournaments, I think I enjoy, you know, the Sunday morning stuff the best, you know. And it's a shifting cast of characters, but and you know, I might not see them outside of basketball, but I consider a great number of them very good friends, and that's the terrific thing.
Dave, your most recent tournament and your next tournament, what are you working towards?
Well, you know, all things being equal, my last tournament was up in Queensland, and we squeaked a bronze medal in. I'm hoping to go back to Pan Pacifics this year. I've got a bit of a wonky knee, so we'll have to see about that. But I've had a shoulder replacement already, so that helped a bit. So, yeah, hopefully we'll be putting together a decent team to go back to the Gold Coast.
Sunday morning's important to you. You get there most Sundays. What is it about the Sunday morning training session that keeps you coming back?
Well, I think they're competitive, you know, without being chippy. This is probably a little indelicate, but one of the great things about Myths and Legends is that there's kind of like a zero asshole quotient, you know, in policy. So, you know, the number of times that there's been any argy-bargy, you know, in the years I've been doing it can be counted on less than one hand. So I think it's about fellowship. It's about having, a good time, and then the fitness as well. I mean, the thing I tell people is that you can only go to the gym so much. I walk every day and whatever, but I don't know whether I'd have the will to get the kind of cardio fitness that everybody needs unless there was a team environment and had some enjoyment attached to it rather than being a grudge activity. So to me, that's, it's fun, fitness, and fellowship, I would say, are the three things that endear me to Myths and Legends.
I think there's also a very strong sense of values in the organisation that a lot of us talk about. Tell us perhaps about the qualities that make a great player and also the qualities that make a great team when you think back over the arc of your career.
Yeah, great players. God, that's tough. I mean, I think most people will say that the people that put in the hard yards, that really trained hard, that honed their skills, that listened to coaches. If they were fortunate, they had mentors that helped them along the way, but they were really committed. In terms of a team, I think it's getting all the pieces that work together, and an all-star team will always beat a team of all-stars. So everybody knowing their role, being willing to share the ball, going that extra mile, and looking after one another, I think is very important as well.
Well, Dave, a question without notice. Yeah. You're an ad man.
Yep.
If you were charged with building the profile and participation rate of Masters basketball across Australia, arguably one of the best kept secrets we have, how would you go about building the awareness and the participation?
Well, George, I think I'd be doing a very aggressive PR campaign about Myths and Legends. I don't know that too many of the members have an appreciation for, how unique Myths and Legends is. I mean, first of all, in terms of the number of people that are involved in it, either actively or tangentially, is enormous. It would be the biggest club of its sort in the world. And the fact that people from 30 to 80 are involved is just really quite extraordinary. So I think you've got an asset here. So I'd be getting the papers down here all the time, the news outlets to tell the story of Myths and Legends.
I think Myths and Legends is part of that story, but there are some great Masters clubs here in Victoria and also interstate. In Victoria, we're pleased to be able to compete regularly with Westies and with Wildcats. But if we go over to Adelaide, there's a really strong Masters basketball ethic over there amongst the Adelaide Masters crowd. And of course, we've got Pirates and lots of other teams that we see at the Pan-Pacific Games in particular. So if you to think nationally, is there a space for a national Masters basketball league or more tournaments other than the multi-sport tournaments that we all go to, like Australian Masters Games and Pan-Pacific Games? Is there a big Masters Basketball Week, for example, which might be the equivalent to the FIMBA event that happened in Argentina not long ago?
Yeah, I think those are all possibilities. I think the unfortunate thing is the more that you load the calendar, the more difficult it is for people who have active lives and work and family and what have you. But I think it's a tremendous story. I mean, I think if you wanted an example of how this can lead to life's longevity, I mean, it is extraordinary how few members have passed in our group, even though the age demographic gets older and older. So again, I keep coming back. It's the fitness, but the social engagement is incredibly important as we get older as well. So I guess all of those stories can be told. I think basketball is a little intimidating because it's a very kinetic sport, and you hear stories of people blowing out their knees and hips and what have you. But you just have to look at those Masters competitions to see that they pace themselves at a level so that it's not going to create chronic body harm to those individuals that are participating.
How's your health, broadly speaking?
I had a heart attack about 6 years ago, which came as a bit of a surprise. Had a couple of stents put in, and I'm on medication now. So I'm probably lighter than I was 15 years ago. So my health's pretty good, but you can't take anything for granted. So, as somebody said, treat today like your last day, because someday you might be right. So.
Well, Dave, not only are you still playing, but you're still working. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about what you're doing these days.
Well, George, that's a bit flattering. I do some executive coaching. I had a pretty extensive career after my actual full working days were over in board directorships, and I did that for a while. But now it's basically mentoring and executive coaching, though as I get older, I realize I'm reaching my use-by date. So, my commitment to work is kind of dwindling, and I'm spending more time walking and painting watercolor pictures. So there you go.
We'll talk a little bit about your art. But, are there parallels between basketball coaching and executive coaching?
Oh, I think very definitely. Typically, from my perspective anyway, in executive coaching, you're dealing with interpersonal issues, by and large. They may manifest themselves in other aspects of business, but in the final analysis. So, particularly if you're working at the executive level, getting the best out of your people, being focused, being clear in terms of what your expectations are, I think is very analogous to a basketball coach looking after a team and trying to find success, but through a group effort rather than a coterie of individuals who are stellar.
At the complete other end of the swimming pool is this.
Pick up the ball here.
Well done. Your art brings something else to your life that you don't necessarily get on the basketball court, nor in coaching executives. So perhaps you can tell us a bit about the art that you've done, and I guess what's inspired you.
Yeah, it's the one good thing that came out of COVID for me is that I hadn't done really any art for 50 years, back since my high school days. But interesting enough, I think I had an interesting presentation by a guy that was focused on mindfulness. And one of the things that he talked about were activities where you're not consciously thinking about things. And I find with art, I can spend hours painting a picture and not worry about anything. So I think the sport gives you the fitness, and you got to find those activities where you can be mindful without having to be caught up in your day-to-day worries.
Great origin story. Basketball's been a theme of your life. You've been blessed with a career that's taken you across the oceans to various cultures, and you're still leading a pretty active life. What's on the bucket list, Dave?
Gosh, good question. I'd like to go to the Masters with one of my sons. I'd like to go to the French Open with another one of my kids. My daughter's a very keen tennis player, and that's the only one of the big three that we haven't been to. And my wife and I like to travel, so there's still lots of places on the bucket list in terms of destinations. But I have to say life's pretty good, so I've got no complaints.
Dave, guidance for the youth of today who are perhaps tentative about basketball, what words of encouragement would you give them, given that you've been able to enjoy the sport your whole life?
Yeah, I think that there's such a focus on performance, and it's an issue particularly in the U.S., but I think it's pretty global now, where everybody has aspirations to play on the big stage, and not everyone is destined to make a career out of basketball, but it's a lifetime activity if you commit to it. And from my perspective, it's just been a wonderful asset for me to meet people, to stay fit, and really have a sense of fulfillment.
And Dave, words of encouragement for the 35 to 45-year-olds. The way that the industry is structured, lots of over 35 competitions at every stadium across the country. But at 45, you start slowing down, and at 50, you can no longer compete as effectively in an over 35s comp. So what would you say to those 45-year-old people who are thinking about staying on the couch and playing with a remote control?
Yeah, I think, there's always this sense that when you're no longer at your peak performance, it's time to hang it up. And again, I point to the Miss example, but you quite rightly point out that there's lots of other senior clubs around the country and around the world. It is easy to stay engaged. I just would say, just don't leave it too long. I think one of the complaints that people have is they said, I didn't play basketball for 3 or 4 years. I wish I had. And when I came out, I blew up my knee, or I pulled an Achilles because, I just didn't stay in shape. So I think life is complex, and at 35, you're trying to maximize your career, and you've got kids that are going off to college and what have you, and you're worried about them as well. So there's lots of competing activities that are going on to occupy you. But if you can carve out a little space, and if you enjoy basketball, it's something that you should keep doing.
Dave, if you think about all of the experiences that you've had, what kind of impact has basketball had on your life?
Well, I don't think my life would be quite the same without basketball. I mean, there's a myriad of people who, I'm very close with, and stay in contact with regularly, who I know through basketball. Again, as I said, going to a new country, it can be a little intimidating. And one of the great things of, breaking in and getting a better understanding of, the lifestyle there has been through basketball. So it's opened a lot of doors. It's introduced me to a lot of people, and it's allowed me to stay in shape and engaged. So, I'm very grateful.
I have the pleasure of playing with you regularly, and you've got a very, very shifty and uncanny ability to put another player in between me and you when I'm trying to defend, and you've still got a deadly accurate 2-point shot. I hope to play with you for a very long time, Dave. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you, George.
It's clear that you're not a myth, you're an absolute legend.
Oh, that's not true, but I appreciate that. Thanks so much.
We appreciate the contribution you've made to the game.